Greetings. Hi, hello. Hello, Internet. How are you doing this bright and sunny day? Bright and sunny where you may be for sure. Anyway, long story short, uh, I have a gentleman awaiting, chomping at the bit to get telling us bits and pieces. It's a pleasure for me to welcome Doug Sinclair, Rhodesian Air Force. I think maybe when you started, it was still the Royal Rhodesian Air Force. I'm not sure, but you can tell us all about that. So, without much further ado, I will say to you that if for those of you that are aware of the Fighting Men of Rhodesia YouTube channel, uh, I met Doug there already, and I've had a chat with him telephonically, and it's great to know that he's going to tell us some very interesting stories. I did ask him to start with his early life and his uh, what made him join the Air Force and the likes, but I also asked him to begin by telling us South Africans what a K car is and what a G car was and all these kinds of things. Because we knew about troopers and we knew about gunships, and we have a few things in common, Doug and myself. Allo's played an important part in our life, and I do believe we have something else in common too. The day we stepped out of the Air Force, that was the last time we touched airplanes. But now I'm really jumping the gun. So I'm going to pipe up now. I'm going to say, welcome, Doug. It is one hell of a pleasure to have you come and chat with the Legacy Conversations audience. I do thank you, and I do say, all yours, sir.
Thank you very much for your welcome. And I also thank Koos for inviting me to come to give my podcast. And we'll fire away. Um, I was born in Salisbury, the capital of Rhodesia. I was brought up on a farm near Katama railway siding. And in those early days, little did I know, we were very close to the Katama mission, the mission school. And that is where Robert Mugabe had been schooled. So I only learned that many years later. Anyway, my father was a tobacco farmer, and we didn't have electricity on the farm. We didn't have a tractor on the farm. Uh, our fridge was a charcoal cooler, and we started off in a corrugated iron house with Hessian partitions inside the house to divide the rooms. Anyway, uh, it was a wonderful life, that part that I could remember. My old man, because we didn't have a tractor, he relied on cattle to do all his land preparation and pulling the big buck wagon, that is the wagons with wooden spoked wheels and tires, which were made of metal. But we also had a wagon made from an old lorry, and that was drawn by a team of 6 mules. I referred that to the high speed wagon. And it was these modes of transport where we used to go to the Katama railway siding and collect the fertilizers and whatever other farm inputs were required. And that's where the old man used to send his bales of tobacco as well, put them on the train to send them off to go to Salisbury to the tobacco auctions. So there weren't easy times in those days. I went to a school by the name of Rutledge School in Salisbury. And then later on, I went to a senior school in the country. It was at a place called Gutuma, and the name of the school was Jamison High, actually named after Dr. Jamison, who was part of the Rhodes fur trekkers in the early days. Anyway, with the high school, we soon learned that when we became cadets, school cadets, we soon learnt about security and guard duties. The reason was, near Gatuma, we had a huge township. It was called Rumuka Township. And the reason it was such a huge township where all the Africans were housed, high density, is because we had a lot of cotton ginnery and cotton uh, textiles all in that area. And in the days when the Rhodesian government had a couple of problems with the insurgents. They weren't insurgents then, but inciting the masses in the townships to actually rebel. Certain measures were taken. And one of the measures was, it was the first time I'd seen a Canberra bomber fly over Gatuma, over our school. And what he was doing is he was going to drop leaflets over Ramuka Township to try and reason with the masses and quell their unrest. Then a little later on, one day a helicopter arrived and landed on the cricket pitch. And out came these blokes in their lovely blues and went to the school hall to have a recruiting talk, trying to persuade us young boys to go into the Air Force. There were recruiting talks by the army and the police and also customs as well. Anyway, because of these aircraft appearing and going, etc., my interests were raised with the Air Force. I just want to go back to this helicopter when he arrived at the cricket pitch. After the talk, the old blue jobs went back to the helicopter. It started up, his rotor started turning, and he did all sorts of checks and shut down. There was a problem with the helicopter. And these bucks got out, and obviously they went to the headmaster's office to see if they could phone and get help. The next day, help arrived, and these blokes pitched up with their spares. I'll tell you what it's about now, and got to work. What it was a slipping clutch on that Alouette. I think you flight engineers know all about that. And so these blokes did a clutch change. When they had completed the job, the air crew came back and got in, started at the chopper, and hell, it took ages for this thing to run up. And yeah, we thought it was never going to take off. What we learnt about later is actually there were quite a few checks that the air crew had to do to make sure the clutch was engaging at the right RPM and etc. So there were a lot of checks to be done. We got a little bored of that, but that's just part of the story. Anyway, at the end of 1964, that was my time up at school. I'd finished O-level. I did apply for farming jobs, but that didn't materialize. So I ended up applying to the Air Force, and I got my reply that yes, report to New Serum on, I've forgotten the date, it was sometime in January, for your selection interviews. Well, we arrived on the day, and there was 60 of us who pitched up on that day. And it took quite a while for us, each bloke, to be interviewed. Now, what we learned is there were another 2 days of interviews. So it was a huge reviewing course, if you want to call it that. Anyhow, luckily later, I got my invitation to report in your serum on the 1st of March of 1965. And as I say, we were school leavers, young blokes wet behind the ears. And they were all very courteous to us at the boom, at the guard room, and Mr. Sinclair and Mr. So-and-so. But when we were assembled and walked up to the ground training school past the parade square, that courtesy seemed to change. And when the sergeant major came out, I say sergeant major, the warrant officer of the ground training school, he was a disciplinarian and he soon cut us down to size. He was dishing out instructions for haircuts left, right, and center, and the normal thing for when you attest into the military. We weren't as hard off as the brown jobs were. When I say brown jobs, I mean the army. We refer to us blue jobs as the Air Force chaps. And we had roughly 2 hours. Well, we started off in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, doing your PT, then going to breakfast or have a shower, breakfast. Then at 8 o'clock for 2 hours, you'd be on the parade square. Then at about 10 o'clock, you'd have tea time and go in for lectures. And this happened on day by day, a regular routine. And we did 4 months of this ground training school, doing all the initial training. The very initial parts is learning the ranks in the Air Force and who you saluted and how you saluted and blah, blah, blah. Lots of that. Anyway, after the first 4 months, we were then sent out to the squadrons. Now, our rank on us, we didn't have any rank on our sleeves. We were just the juniors. And we went out to our certain sections, if you were armorers or instruments or electricians, but the airframe fitters and engine fitters. Now, in our Air Force, airframe fitters and engine fitters were separate trades, unlike the SAF. We were seconded to squadrons, certain squadrons. And I was posted to Thornhill, which was the town called Guello. And the Thornhill Air Base, I was seconded to 2 squadron, which were the Vampires. The Vampire T-11s. When we started, the FB9s, the single-seaters, had been phased out because they were deemed a little too dangerous for pilots to bail out. Because when a pilot bailed out of a FB9, it was a very tricky procedure for him not to end up crucified on the tailboom. Anyway, we did, I've forgotten how long it was. I think it was about 6 months on the squadron and real runabouts and being shouted at and normal military procedures. And it was time to go back to ground training school back in New Zealand. This time, the courses were getting a little bit more advanced. All of our independent trades, I was an airframe fitter. And when we left that intermediate course, we now wore a badge of rank. It was a propeller, a 3-bladed propeller on your left arm. And off we went back to our squadrons, sections, and whichever station it was. I ended up back in Thornhill on Vampires again. When that term was up, we went back to ground training school for the 3rd time and did the more advanced part where if we passed our exams, we would end up as junior qualified technicians. So when we left ground training school after that 3rd session, we now had a single stripe on our left-hand shoulder, the same as a lance corporal, but we were called junior technicians. I just want to go back. I forgot to mention, when you had the 3 propeller, that was called, you were called an L, a leading aircraftsman, LAC. And of course, with the 1 stripe, we now are junior technicians. So we went back to our squadrons and stations, and once again, I ended up on Vampires. I had no idea why. And spent quite a long time in these Vampires. I got to know them very well. I will go through the next couple of postings quickly, so I don't bore anyone. After a while, the warrant officer of ASF, now ASF was the Aircraft Servicing Flight. In Yeserum, it was a much bigger concern, and that was called ASS, and that was Aircraft Servicing Squadron. Anyway, this warrant officer, he poached me, and I ended up in ASF. In ASF, we were actually, I started off by doing a minor service on a Vampire T11. Once that was completed, I did some time in the component section. There in the component section, we were refurbishing or inspecting components that were lifed or components that had a snag, a problem. A lot of my work was on the dual relay valves, pneumatic dual relay valves, both for the Vampires and the Provosts, and pressure relief valves on the pneumatics, all the pneumatic components. I also did work on hydraulic components, which is in the Vampire, your dual relay valves, etc., and pressure reducing valves. That was quite interesting. But then they wanted somebody in wheelbase. So I ended up in wheelbase, and in fact, I was the only person in wheelbase. And every wheel that came back from a squadron because the tread was worn, or some other problem, the creep market had crept too much, whatever the issue was, why they had to change it in the squadron, the wheel came to us. We'd deflate the wheel, strip it down, remove all the paint with paint remover, wash it, and then use, it was called an Ardrox crack detection. It was a red dye. And we'd spray the rim with dye, wash that off with white spirits, and then put chalk powder on. And if there was a crack, it would show up straight away as a red line. If that happened, the wheel would be scrapped. If everything was clean, you washed the wheel again, prepared it for painting, you painted it. Once it was dry, you got back to the wheel bay itself, because we had a separate paint section, and then assembled the wheel. All our wheels in those days had tubes. We didn't have tubeless tires. And once the wheel was already inflated, we would inflate them in a cage. The reason we did that is if there was a fault and a rim should separate or a tire burst, at least all the bits and pieces would be contained in the cage and you would not be injured. Well, that was just a precaution because I never heard of that happening in my days in the Air Force. I was starting to get a little bored on the squadron, on the ASF, and I applied for a posting to one squadron and it went through. I was there on one squadron with the Hunter aircraft, and I was there about a year. It was nice working on the aircraft, but because you were a junior, you were just working on the line most of the time, doing first line servicing. In other words, looking after the aircraft on the hard standings and seeing to the pilots, helping them strap in when they're about to go out, and the normal procedures of seeing the aircraft start and seeing it out, and then waiting for it to come back from its sortie, and you do all your after-flight checks and replenishing of oils, that whole procedure. Anyway, for squadron, which was at that stage only the Trojans. Trojans were the Aeromacchi AL-60B. It was an Italian-made aeroplane. And it had a very similar DNA to your bloke's Bosbok. Anyway, with the Trojans, some incursions had started with the terrorists, and there was some activity out in the bush, and I had itchy feet. That's where I wanted to go. I wanted to get out in the bush and see some action, if there would be any action in those days. And I discovered there was a chap on 4 Squadron. His name was Mike Melton. He was now engaged, and he didn't want to do bush trips anymore because he wanted to be with his fiancée. And I learned of this. We spoke to each other, and he wanted to get off 4 Squadron. And so I said, well, let's apply for a swap. So we went to OC Tech, that's Officer Commanding Tech Wing, spoke to him, and he said, well, I don't see any problem. Go back to your squadron warrant officers and put in for your posting, and I will approve it. And that's what happened. It happened very quickly. The next minute, I was now on 4 Squadron. As I said, it was only Trojan aircraft. Yeah, we did our initial training. Well, I had to do my initial training on the aircraft. That was on Squadron, where you'd go with the different trade technicians and they'd show you the ropes. And because I wasn't an engine fitter, we concentrated a lot on that Lycoming engine and how to do magneto-timing, and, all those familiarized me with the engine. And those Trojans had a turbocharger. And those turbochargers had a manually operated wastegate, pretty old-fashioned. And so it was not the easiest of aircraft for the pilots to learn on, because the pilot had to operate the wastegate adjustment to make sure he didn't overboost the aircraft, because it was very easy to overboost the aircraft if you opened the wastegate too much. And of course, as the engine RPM, the turbo RPM built up, the turbo, the inlet manifold pressure would charge up quickly. So it's far more complicated than your Cessnas were. Anyway, after having learned this, I was out onto my first bush trip, and very interesting. In the early stages of my bush trips, we had an incursion of terrorists into Wanky Game Reserve. And we had to form a detachment. I've forgotten the name of the place, but it was right on the edge of the Wanky Game Reserve. And there was a camp made up. In those days, we didn't have our own security chaps to be able to guard the aircraft. So we positioned there every day with the Trojan and had to fly back to Wanky every night. But one of the interesting parts there with this operation was the communications. These blokes pitched up. I don't know if chaps nowadays understand what I'm talking about. It was a forward control Land Rover. It was about a 2-tonner. And this is what the communication center was built into. That unit was actually called the TAC 14. Now, with the TAC 14, the ComSen, our Rhodesians did not, sorry, I'm just trying to look at my notes here. Our Rhodesians did not have a telecommunication expert. Our technicians looked after the radios and the teleprinters and all that lot. Those teleprinters were pretty complicated machines, and they came from South Africa. This is where we got a lot of help from the South Africans. With the Trojans now, everyone made a big joke of these poor aircraft. I could be corrected, but depending on its configuration, because we now fitted rocket pods. They were the SNEB rocket pods. I think there was 18 tubes for each pod, one pod on each side. And they took the 37 millimeter SNEB rocket. So that caused a hell of a drag on the poor aeroplane and some extra weight. So we had about a 15 knot variation difference between stalling speed and cruising speed. So this poor aeroplane struggled. So most of the time it was flying at a very high throttle setting. And this caused the propeller to be running at a speed where the propeller tips were at a speed of the sound barrier, the speed of sound. So they were making a hell of a noise. And this was a noisy aircraft when it flew past. So this is where the jokes came out about this poor aeroplane. Because it was so slow, it was named the only aircraft in the Air Force that could get a bird strike on the trailing edge. Why did it make so much noise? Well, it was converting fuel to noise. That was its job. Poor aircraft. Why did the aircraft make so much noise? Another one. Because it was the 5 cylinders clapping for the one doing all the work. What was the theory of flight of the Trojan? It was different to all other aeroplanes. I think everyone in the Air Force knows all about the theory of flight. But the Trojan's theory of flight was it relied on the curvature of the Earth to get airborne. Poor aircraft. But it did its job. On 4 Squadron, we had the Kivets parked there, the Cessna 185s. They came from 42 Squadron from Potchefstroom. So those blokes were based with us on the squadron, and we got to know especially their techs very well, their pilots very well known to our pilots, and that's how it worked. Now, the reason the Kivets were there is because you blokes had, well, South Africa, when I say you blokes, had SAP operating up on the border. So there were huge SAP camps, and that relieved our blokes to go elsewhere to monitor the border and actions at the border and incursions, whatever. So those policemen were actually doing an army job while they were there. And the Kivets were there to be helping them, the same as the Trojans were there to help us. With the Trojans, we did a lot of river patrols, looking for crossings of canoes or dinghies. And we did a fair amount of reconnaissance for individual army majors when they moved into the area, and the aircraft to take the army major up to show him his area so he could become familiar with it from the air. We did supply dropping. That's where we had removed the one side rear door. It only had a rear door on one side. And that's where we had throw out either water to troops who are now stranded on the ground and calling for that, or giving troops resupply of rations. And in the early days, we learned that we lost a lot of water drops. And in order to make a water drop more successful, we get the canister from the SNEB rockets, which was a very secure thing, and put bags of frozen water, ice, into these, and they would be parachuted out. So if it had a hard landing, if the parachute failed, the call sign on the ground would still have their water, because all they'd have to do is thaw out the ice and they'd have the water. Just things like this of interest. When I was talking about the Kivet blokes, I just want to mention some names. Johan Swart, his name was Blackie. I think every bloke in South Africa, his name was Blackie if his surname was Swart. And Barry Dino. They were two chaps that have now passed away, unfortunately. But we got on very well with them and the others, but I'll name the others just now. But with these two blokes, you dare and try and drink them under the table. That was your peril. We got on very well with them, And we took some leave at one stage, drove down to Potchefstroom, stayed there a week at Potchefstroom with them. This was very interesting because they took us to 42 Squadron and showed us around there, introduced us to a lot of people there that hadn't been up to Rhodesia. And later on, after that week, I'm jumping the gun. I learnt two things when we were there. In Potchefstroom, I'd never been to a real spit and sawdust pub. We thought we had pubs like that in Rhodesia, but no. In Potchefstroom, they took us to this pub and it had real sawdust right across the floor. And that sawdust retained the smell of booze. So when you walked in, you really had the full-on effect of a good old-fashioned pub. And I was impressed with this. Another introduction we had, we went to Barry's house, Blackie's house, I should say, to have a braai there. And, you know, in Rhodesia, we have sadza, which was the maize meal, stiff maize meal. And you blokes called it pap. But it was the first time I was introduced to krimmel pap. And I think you blokes are familiar with that. The genuine crumbly pap. And hell, I made a pig of myself. Anyway, later on, we went down to Cape Town, drove down there with Barry and Blackie. And yeah, it was one of those scenes where the next day you had to ask your friend, did I have a good time last night? That was the sort of holiday that ended up. And the other blokes that were on 42 Squadron that did there quite a lot of time up at Rhodesia was Wavell King. His nickname was Boots King. He was a sergeant major, but he did same work as everyone else up there, looking after the aircraft. Because when their aircraft was based at Wankie and Kariba, which was FAF 1, FAF 2, FAF meaning Forward Airfield, you know, they just had one bloke looking after the aircraft, the same as us. Then there was also Nice Combrink. I will send you a photograph of Wavell King and Nice Combrink and put it up on the screen for you. There was also another chap by the name of, I think his surname was Lowe, Henry Lowe, and many others. But we got on well with those 42 Squadron blokes. With our bush trips, Rhodesia now did some army work in Mozambique. They joined the Portuguese troops to do stints there. I think the Portuguese troops wanted to learn from our SAS and RLI how to do it. But once they had to leave the road to do following of tracks or whatever, they weren't keen on that. So after a while, our troops decided, no, we're not going to operate with the Portuguese anymore because they would always rattle their tins and make a noise to let the terrorists know that they were there. And I think they had an untold understanding that we will not interfere with each other because those terrorists are now not Mozambique terrorists, they are Rhodesian terrorists. So that's the way it went on. So now with our blokes, I think the RLI were going to be relieved for Christmas and New Year, and the SAS moved in. And with the SAS, we had a changeover of 4 helicopters, which were G-cars. I'll tell you about that in a moment. And with our 1 Trojan, we left New Serum on, I've forgotten what day it was before Christmas, to fly to a place called Chikawa. Now, Chikawa is now about 150 feet underwater because of Cobora Bassa, the backup of water. But Cobora Bassa was still in the early stages of the wall being built when we went there. Anyway, we were on our way, pilot, myself, with our kit, as self-sufficient as we could be. And on our way, after we had taken off the 4 helicopters, the troopers, G-cars, they took off from New Serum. And when we were at a beam of Mount Darwin, we were still inside Rhodesia. These 4 helicopters flew past us. So it shows you how slow the Trojan was. Yes, all right, the helicopters are fairly empty, but we were the laughing stock because of that. Anyway, on landing at Chikawa, they had an airfield there. Our Trojan was to do Telstar duties because there was no high hills in the area where we could put a repeater station or a rebro. And we shared that duty with a Portuguese aircraft, and right now I just can't remember the name of it. But it was a nice little aircraft. They used it as a spotter plane by the Germans in the German days. He also had a set of rocket pods, the Strela pods, exactly the same as ours. When we got to the camp, that's where the helicopters were parked on a soccer field. And there were 8 helicopters there now. It was our 4 G cars and 4 of Portuguese K cars. It was the first time we had seen these machines with 20mm weapons fitted to them. And with those K cars, the Portuguese K cars, they had the pilot and the gunner. They referred to him as the gunner, but I think he was also the flight engineer. But he was a commissioned officer, which was different to the way we operated later. Just a little story there. We also learned that just before we had arrived, one of these K-car, one of the techs, the flight engineers, was cleaning his 20mm weapon and obviously cocked it to test it. And he obviously didn't do it properly, and he had an AD, an accidental discharge. And that round, remember it's a high explosive, an HE, it went straight into the mess tent and killed the cook. But the attitude of these Portuguese blokes was unreal. When they're telling us the story, oh, no fashmal, no loss. You was a shit cook anyway. Anyway, that was the attitude there. We spent Christmas and New Year there, but as I said, our SAS blokes decided, they're going to operate on their own. And they were operating in an area called New Mugwe. And New Mugwe is also underwater now with Cobora Bassa. But they accidentally walked right into a terrorist camp. They actually didn't realize they'd walked past the sentries and they were right in the middle of the camp. And of course, when they realized each other, there was all hell let loose and lots of firing. We were airborne at that time. We were the Telstar, and straight away we came down to treetop level with the Trojan, and we're buzzing the area where they were. The reason of that is the tours actually seemed to bombshell, but our blokes knew they were now surrounded and didn't actually know where the terrorists were. So our pilot, his name was Graham Cronshaw, he spoke to them and we agreed that we would buzz the area at treetop level. and keep on buzzing it to try and draw any fire if anyone was around. And then our troops would actually know where resistance would be. But we were unscathed. Nobody shot at us. These terrorists got such a fright, they bomb-shelled and they all ran away. Now, that was a very heavily wooded area, and our blokes, the SS chaps on the ground, needed our G cars to come in and give assistance. But there was no LZs, no landing zones in that area. So a G car had to go and hover in and drop them a saw. Now that saw was a push-pull saw. They didn't have a chainsaw available. So these poor blokes had to cut an LZ. It must have been hard work because they were mapani trees. But once they'd cut the LZ, now our G cars could come in and bring extra troops in and do more reconnaissance of the area. It was a very, very well established camp, so much so that they had an underground hospital. Now, in those early days, remember this was about 1968. This is the first time our blokes had come across such a thing. And as I say, it was a very well-equipped underground hospital. So our troopers, the G cars, had a lot of work to do now. I don't know, this is a good time now to explain in the middle of this 4-squadron part what a G car was. A G car was a general purpose helicopter. G for general purpose helicopter. So he could be in many different configurations. Most of our wartime, he was in a trooper configuration. When he was in a trooper configuration, he'd have a weapon fitted on the port side at back door. Of course, the door is removed. And the troops, the back troops, would sit in the seats facing forward, and we had a bench seat in the front with the troops facing with their back to direction of flight. And that's the trooping configuration. The other configurations, as all you flight engineers would know, was cargo swinging, hoisting. We also had a tear gas roll where we fitted tear gas racks under the steps of the Alouette 3, and they would hold all the tear gas canisters for riot control. Or the aircraft, as you know, could fly with all the doors on in a VIP configuration where you'd fly very important people around, whoever they may be. Now you get to the K car. K, I assume, is for killer, the killer car. And the K car, once he was made up into his configuration, that Alouette 3, it could not be quickly changed into another configuration to do some other sorting. He was now strictly in the K car configuration, as you flight engineers knew, fitted with the 20mm cannon. Now, going back to these 4K cars that were in Chikawa, I don't remember them being used at all on any op. So I think those blokes were a little scared to even go into a contact. I could be corrected there. But our blokes' interest in this it was unreal. You must know all our chopper techs and pilots, how they were observing every little detail of these K cars. And in later years, of course, we knew what we wanted, and our blokes somehow inherited these. I don't know how. We got past sanctions and got some 20mm fits and made our K cars at a later date. While we were still doing our Trojan work, a signal came through to our pilot to say, listen, we've had some malfunctions with these Sneb rockets, these 37mm Sneb rockets. and we want you to try them out. So we used to do our tailstar duties very high up. I've forgotten what altitude, at least 8,000, maybe more feet AGL. And this is when Graham said, okay, we've had the signal, we've got to fire these rockets and try them out. So we more or less lined ourselves up with the Zambezi River, pointed down the Zambezi River, and fired these rockets. We selected ripple fire, so we had a ripple launch. I've forgotten how many seconds in between each rocket being fired, and you'd fire the whole pod. This is one of the most frightening experiences I'd had in my life, because these rockets misbehaved. They were going off. Some of them went in the true direction, but these are going, they went off in all sorts of different directions. You could see the smoke trails. And two of these rockets decided they were going to do a U-turn and come straight back at us. And that was the scary moment. Well, there was we were told to carry on flying with armed pods, but we were reluctant to use them if they had to be in the future. What resulted in that was, of course, with our pilot reporting it back, is they looked into the reason why. And our Air Force, we were subject to many cases where we had to get things through the back door because of UDI, and people took advantage of this, salesmen, I assume, and sold us duff equipment that they knew should have been destroyed, but let's sell them to Rhodesians, we'll make some money. These rockets had plastic fins. So when they were in the tube, in the folded up position, the adjacent tube got so hot from that rocket being fired that its tube now started melting the fins of this rocket. And so it was a domino effect. And some rockets weren't affected. Some rockets only had one fin melted and he went in a certain direction. But I think those that had two fins melted, they were the ones that came back reverse to us. That's what we assume. So a lot of those rockets had to be disposed of. I don't know if they were modified as metal fins later, but I know at a later date we did get the correct rockets with metal fins, and that was no longer a problem. I thought I'd bring it up just as a point of interest. Another scary incident we had, we were doing a river patrol. It was the valley, the Kariba Gorge, coming into Kariba, at the top end of Kariba. So we were flying upriver with this gorge going up on each side. And we were doing our normal river patrol there. And all of a sudden we heard, between the pilot and I, tee-hee-hee over the intercom. So we looked at each other because we thought the other chap was saying tee-hee-hee. And no sooner had we looked at each other trying to figure out, what the hell are you getting at? And we just said, "Ah!" over us. And this was a hawker hunter that came up behind us. He was the pilot that transmitted and said, tee-hee-hee, went over us and up the gorge. What he didn't realize is that we were now in trouble, because the wake and turbulence that hunter had left, we were now struggling with the turbulence to try and remain airborne, because we were only about 15 feet, maybe 20 feet above the water. And luckily Graham was a well-experienced pilot, and he just shoved the throttle forward, didn't worry about over boosting the engine at that stage. Nobody was worried then, and just pulled full flap. And there we were wallowing, trying to regain normal flight. Scary incident that. I'm sure Graham tried to find out who that pilot was. a later date. With those rocket pods on the Trojan, when they were doing range programs at Katanga Range, sometimes the pilots pulled a little bit too much G. I think we were restricted to 3G, if I'm rightly. And some pilots pulled just that little bit more G. And what happened on one particular aeroplane, it rippled its wings. The upper surface of the main planes was just rippled from that stress. Now the Air Force had to have a rethink. We can't really use, because those rockets, often with a contact, they were used to either mark a target for the jets when they came in, or to use them to help an army call sign where they had these blokes in a cave and we could go and use the rockets to try and clear the cave, whatever. But anyway, after that incident, the Air Force had to now take I think it was six provosts from 6th Squadron, the training squadron, and bring them to 4th Squadron for us to have now armed aircraft. The Trojans could no longer carry rocket pods. So the provosts were now the armament side of the 4th Squadron wing. And the provosts had two 303 Browning guns, one in each wing, and they could carry bombs not exceeding 250 kg, I think it is. They could carry Frantan, and Frantan was used quite a lot by them for marking targets thereon. So at that stage, we still had the Trojans and the 4 provosts. It was a much later date, after I'd left the squadron, that the Cessnas came along, the Cessna Skymasters. And they were immediately modified with guns. I think they were the military type Cessna, so they did have hard points for Frantans, etc. With my stint on 4th Squadron, I suddenly got a call one day. We were at Katanga Range, and we got a signal through that they wanted Doug Sinclair back at Thornhill Base immediately. And I was actually flown in a provost back to Thornhill. Unusual, flying a tech for a special whatever. But when I arrived at Thornhill, there was quite a few other blokes assembled in Air Wing headquarters, and they were waiting for me, and I walked in my camouflage kit, unlike everyone else who were in their blues. And we were told that there's going to be a special operation, top secret at this time, but we were going to be mini ambassadors, and we were the chosen ones to go to South Africa and join up with 2 Squadron, that was Twee Skader in the Waterkloof, and learn all about the Mirages. We later learned that some of our pilots had already started there. When we had heard that, we had to do all sorts of preparations and go to the customs office and get temporary export permits for our vehicles, because we had to bring them back again and whatever. And that was a big change in my Air Force career. Before I go on to talk about that part of it, I forgot to mention we got up to quite a few different pranks. And one of them was I had a Gilera motorcycle, a 50cc Gilera motorcycle. And somehow we discovered if you left it in gear and pushed it backwards, the engine would actually start in reverse. And wow, straight away, this gave us an idea. So the one day we had a bloke by the name of Clive Roberts. He was a very adventurous bloke and he would try anything. And he didn't know about this. So the one day we got everything ready. I had the motorbike running in reverse, engine in reverse, two chaps standing behind it to catch the motorbike. And we called Clive out. Said, Clive, get on this thing and really give it a good wheelie. He says, I've ridden it before. He said, no, we've tuned this thing up and you must really rev it up and drop the clutch and you see how it goes. And he was revving a little bit. He said, no, rev the guts out of it and drop the clutch and you see how this thing takes off. And he was all prepared to go forward. Well, guess what happened? When he dropped the clutch, this thing took off backwards and he was thrust straight over the handlebars. There was nobody there to catch him, but two blokes to catch my motorbike. We had another armourer. He did all sorts of things, and he discovered how to make touch powder. This touch powder was a concoction. Then, wherever you wanted to use it, you would actually sprinkle some of these crystals. When they dried, it was now touch powder. Our first experiment was to spread it down the veranda of where we were living, the billets. And we would catch the blokes who would come home late from the pub at night and catch them walking down the veranda to their room and set this up. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah, some blokes getting some scary tippy-toe steps and jumping around. But it backfired on us. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, when everyone's sleeping, the ants came across and they started setting this touch powder off. So it woke us up. That was a little bit of a backfire. The next thing we did with this touch powder, we put it, there was a chap who had one of those Volvo fastbacks. It was his pride of joy. He virtually spit and polished this car. It was, and nobody could touch it. Anyway, we managed to get in there somehow and put this touch powder on his clutch pedal, brake pedal, and accelerator. So when he went to this car, I think it was the next day, everyone was waiting to see what had happened. And you can imagine what's happened. When he put his clutch in, bang. When he put his foot in the brake, went bang. And he just sat there shaking his head, nearly crying. What's happening to his car? Another quick one. Our boss, our squadron leader, his name was Boss PB, Peter Boyer. So his initials were PB. And the squadron leader was allowed to drive his car up to the squadron. Most of the other blokes couldn't. And he had an old Morris Minor that he used to drive up to work each day. And the registration on his number plate was RB and the number. It was a very old number plate. RB meaning Rhodesia Below and the number. And we thought about this and blocked out the one leg of the R, so it was now a P. So his registration was now PB for Peter Boyer. And when he walked out one day, after knocking off work and going to his car, of course, we were all behind the corners and watching on to see what had happened. He saw this straight away, and instead of doing a tantrum, he just laughed. He had a huge smile on his face, got in his car and drove off. And for months afterwards, he left it like that. He was proud of it. I just thought I'd bring those up. Anyway, we ended up driving down to South Africa. I drove down in a Land Rover, a long wheelbase Land Rover. It did not have a cab. It had a windscreen. And that's how it was. It was open. And when we got to Woodacliff, unpacked our kit and everything at the mess and found out where we could move in. And that night at the bar, when we were introducing ourselves and having a drink with the SAF blokes, they said, when we saw you blokes arrive, we thought you were bloody old farmers and wondering what the hell you were doing here. So obviously that's what our appearance looked like. Anyway, our first excursion was to go to your ground training school. I think it was somewhere between Waterkloof and Swartkop. You blokes will know where it is. And we did 3 weeks ground training there, learning about the Mirages. It was a very interesting time, learning all about these new high-speed aircraft. I still remember the instructor's name. His name was Dries Kutzer. Some of you blokes may have come across him. And then after that training, we did exams at the end of every week to check our progress. And we then went on to the squadron. Once on the squadron, what nobody told us was brand new blokes. Now, I just want to tell you, we were in Rhodesian uniforms. Seemed odd, but the explanation was we are mini ambassadors there in the SAF, and we will remain in our uniform. But of course, we did everything that you blokes did. So the first morning, Monday morning, was a muster parade. Every morning they had a muster parade, and the OC, the commanding officer, CO, he would do an inspection of all the gentlemen on parade. But when the sergeant major shouted, "Parade, aan, dag," quite a few blokes didn't know what the command was, and it was a chomos, if you want to put it that way. Anyway, we soon learnt the ropes. We fell in with the South Africans quickly and very well. One prominent bloke that really looked after us well, his name was Tubby de Wet, Andre de Wet. And he really looked after us roadies. And we had such a good relationship that a lot of us roadies were actually invited to his wedding. We were honored to be having invited to his wedding. Anyway, we were still in the learning mode about all these aircraft. As I said, in the Rhodesian Air Force, engine fitters and airframe fitters were separate trades. So when we got there, us airframe fitters went onto the line to start first line servicing. And of course, we did the role of airframe engines, the same as the SAF chaps. But of course, we were being taught a lot of this in ground training school. Our engine fitters didn't go on to the first line servicing. The squadron had its own engine shop, and they did some third line servicing on the engines, and that's where our engine technicians went. And of course, the other trades, the electricians went to where they were, and etc. Our radio blokes were actually separated because some of them went to specialize on the radios, and others went to specialize on the radars. So that's where they were split up. Sergeant Major Engelbrecht, he was the squadron sergeant major. We also got on with him very well. And if I may mention it, the squadron had some traditions, and one of them that struck us, we came from, well, we had started our war. So you can say we came from a war Air Force, early stages, yes, to South Africa on 2 Escadron on a peacetime Air Force. And that was quite a difference for us. Because when they parked the aircraft, they parked unserviceable aircraft in front of serviceable aircraft, and sometimes at the back of the hangar. And wow, this did not seem right to us. because with us, our serviceable aircraft had to be at the front. So if there was a call out, they came, pulled out, and nothing was in their way. They weren't obstructed. Later on, things did change in that aspect. I think I'll send you a photograph of our chaps on the squadron. I think there was 17 technicians and 7 of our pilots. And with our pilots, a lot of our pilots were fairly junior to all the SAF pilots. It was the only squadron that I knew of where you had your commandant, and I think they had about 6 majors on that squadron. And God only know how many captains. So it was a high-ranking squadron. Strange to us, but that was the makeup. Another chap that, a couple of names. One prominent one, his name was Killian. I think he was a sparky, electrician. But what stood out with him is he was a big man and he had huge hands, very big hands. I think he played a lock forward in rugby. But his nickname was Pisangs because his fingers are so big, they look like bananas, so his nickname was Pisangs. So, yeah, we laughed at that one. I'd mentioned Fanny Engelbrecht, who was a sergeant major. I remember Frickie. Now, we also referred to Sergeant Major Engelbrecht as Fine, and he enjoyed that. Frickie was a civilian. He was in the tech control, and the tech control officer was Commandant Brink. So, yeah, there were many other names. I can't, recall them all. On the squadron, while we were talking about names, on Tuer Squadron, 2 prominent names that have come up later on with your podcasts. At that stage, his name was Lieutenant Chachayano. And he was a good man. He was one of the pilots that actually spent time being sociable with the techs, talking to the techs. Some pilots, they just got out of the cockpit and off they went. But Lieutenant Chachayano, he stood out from that point of view. And of course, I learned later that he became a general of the Air Force. So, interesting there. The other name that stuck out was Major Dick Lord. He was a major at that stage on Tuer Squadron. And I think he became a general in your Air Force in later days. It was a very big squadron we had, which is also, I think, unusual, because the 2 squadron aircraft and the 3 squadron aircraft were all put together on Tuer Squadron. The 2 squadron aircraft had the emblem on the tail of a cheetah. And the 3 squadron aircraft had the emblem of a bee. It looked more like a bumblebee, but I think it was a bee. But anyway, because of this combination, we had, I think, 6 different models of Mirages on the squadron. You had the BZs, which were the trainers for the CZs. You had the DZs, which were the training aircraft 2-seaters for the EZs, which are the single-seaters. And then you had the RZs, which were the reconnaissance configuration aircraft with cameras in the nose instead of a radar, and cameras on the pod under the jet pipe on the tail. And we also had the R2Z. Now the R2Z was an upgraded RZ. I think it had the same engine as the F1 aircraft when you got them. And that aircraft was, I think it's serial number 846. So we had 46 aeroplanes on the squadron. It was a large squadron. And that particular aircraft, I'll just talk about it now, that aircraft was shot down in Angola and its wreckage was actually displayed in Angola, unfortunately. That was the history of that poor aircraft. Our pilots only flew the BZ, which is the trainer, and the CZ. And I'll come to that just now, why. I think you know why. But with the technicians, we couldn't really be segregated there. We only work on those BZs and CZs. So it was understood we just worked on all the models the same as the SAF blokes did. Which, it was very interesting, the different aircraft, but it just fell within our stride. An observation, at one stage, there was 1/3 of the ground crew were SAF, permanent SAF blokes. 1/3 of the ground crew were ACFs, the Active Citizen Force. And the other third, approximately, were made up of us Rhodesian ground crew. So it was interesting times. As I said, our pilots only operated the CZ. I don't know if this is the right time to go into it, whether I'm going to get political sensitivity here. Why were we there? We actually thought the reason we were there, we were going to get the CZs, and I'm sure that was the main reason. There were other stories because your blokes were up our end helping with our war and the kivets and helicopters, which we'll get onto later. We came down to South Africa to reciprocate with the help. I don't think that was the reason, but that was one of the reasons put out. While we were working away, some of us were called upon to go and be kitted out with South African uniforms. Hell, this was strange. What's going on here? And when we were kitted out with those, it was a winter dress, so your blokes had the bunny jackets, which we weren't accustomed to. Anyway, we were then told we are going to Atlas aircraft, the other side of the runway from Jan Smuts Airport. And one of our CZs, we're going to go there for a minor service, flown by a Rhodesian pilot. So yes, we drove there to Atlas. We found out where we were going to work and which service bay was going to be ours. We met the aircraft with the help of the team that was going to do the service, the Atlas team. We doubled up with them. So it wasn't the Rhodesians doing the service on our own. We doubled up with those Atlas blokes to learn all about it. That was the learning curve. Those Atlas blokes, most of the blokes on the Mirage section of the servicing, what do you call it, part of Atlas, they knew exactly who we were. There were no flies that we were in SAF uniforms because they were ex-SAF techs from 2 Squadron already. So those blokes actually just moved across to Atlas and did their work on the Mirages and earned quite a lot more money. But it was good working with them. We learned a hell of a lot. When the aircraft, when we had finished servicing and put it all together again and it was ready for its test flight, we were involved with that, getting it out on the hard standing. A Rhodesian pilot would be brought down to do the air test. And he went up and did his air test. And actually, that pilot, his name was Steve Murray. You blokes have actually interviewed him on your podcast already, on Legacy Guests. And yes, you can never expect a an air test to be accepted the first time, there will always be some little snags, and he brought it back and wrote down whatever was wrong with it and what was to be seen to. And the second air test, he was back again to air test it, and it was accepted. And back we went to Air Squadron. As I said, it was interesting times. All of a sudden, I don't know if I missed anything out. No, let me carry on with detachments. We were involved with all the detachments. One detachment, we went to Durban. We didn't stay, we stayed in Durban town itself. That's where the accommodation was, but drove out to the airport every day. The part of that exercise was the pilots, both Rhodesian and South African, doing supersonic sorties and, familiarization out at sea, where they could break the sound barrier and not worry about the pressure waves causing a bang. We did Bloemfontein a couple of times. Very interesting. It was so cold there that you had fire buckets where our accommodation was, and those fire buckets weren't filled with sand, they were filled with water. And in the morning, those buckets had about an inch of ice on the top. That's how cold it was. Us green Rhodesians, we froze our butts off. And our first occasion we could get time off to get into Bloemfontein, we went straight to your shops and bought long johns. I never ever thought I would wear long johns, but that's what we did. Because on those cold mornings, we would have our normal underwear with the long johns over that, our tracksuits over the long johns, and then our overalls over our tracksuits, and still it was type a lumberjacket type jacket to put on to keep warm. One particular morning, with normal flying routine, but one particular, we had 15 aircraft on the line. We flew 14 aircraft every sortie session. The 15th aircraft was a standby in case there was a big snag on one of the aircraft. And that aircraft, because it hadn't flown, at 9 o'clock in the morning, had the sun shining on it. The part that on the other far side of the aircraft is still in the shade, still had ice on it. So, yeah, we were wearing gloves and you name it. A very interesting time. I cannot remember the figure, but the pilots, they decided there had been a record established by 2 Squadron beforehand on the maximum numbers of sorties flown in one day. And they decided on one particular day, Tower was all aware of it, that we're going to try and break this record. So it was all a team effort. Us roadies were proud to be part of that. The sort of things we would do is, instead of waiting to see when a tyre had to be replaced, when a tyre was, you could just start to see the cords. We anticipated the wheel change and did it before it needed to be changed, just to prevent a delay. Because while we were working on an aircraft on a turnaround, the armourers could not come and work on the aircraft until we had finished. So if we had an aircraft jacked up to do a wheel change, the armourers couldn't move in until we'd finished that, and then they could get in. Of course, we had the pilot sitting in the 700 room, tapping his fingers, waiting for the aircraft to become ready. Because as soon as it was ready, he would run out, get in, and off he went. So it was a real teamwork between techs, pilots, and everything. And yes, we did break the record that day. And I can't remember how many sorties it was. I think it was in the region of 76 sorties. I'm not sure. Done by 14 aircraft. I'm open to correction on that figure. Interesting detachment as well, a couple of times to Langebaan. And of course, at Langebaan, there's all sorts of gunnery, rocketry, and bombing going on. But a lot of the range work was done out at sea. So the blokes on your crash boats, that's what they were called, the Navy boys with the crash boats, they would tow targets out to a specified area in the sea, and then the aircraft would come in and have a go at them. And it was up to these blokes with their craft in between sorties go and paste out the holes and count the number of hits. So the target is now clean for the next aircraft, the next sortie to come in, and that's how it operated. We got to know the sailor boy as well, especially the one chap. And we had a couple of good drink ups with him, so much so that they used to catch crayfish on Parlumun and cook them at home and entertain us roadies. We bring our own beer, etc., and have a good drink up and have this wonderful seafood that his wife would cook up. And I'd never forget how she cooked the parlemun. She'd make up, beat up egg and dip the parlemun in this egg, and that's how she'd fry it. And it was second to none. Going back to the squadron itself, I don't know if it'd be of interest to you blokes, but I'll come up with it anyway. The pilots did air-to-air gunnery. What that involved was an Impala pulling a flag. And I think he towed the flag at about 300 meters behind him. And I don't know what speed he was going at, maybe 250, 300 knots, I'm not sure. And he'd pull this flag around, and the Mirages go up and shoot at this flag. Each pilot had his ammunition dipped in a different color dye. And they would use ball rounds, not HE. So if he had a couple of hits on this flag, one pilot would have blue dye and the other pilot would have yellow dye. And when the flag came back down, this is how they could count the number of hits and who had how many hits. They had a very expensive air-to-air gunnery session at the end. It was only at the end of the gunnery session, because of the expense, there was a unit called a Sule. What the Sule was, it was being towed by an aircraft in place of a flag. And the Sule looked like a little bit like a missile, and it had a radio equipment inside it and could sense if the rounds came close to it or how close rounds could come to it being fired. Of course, looking like a missile, it was a very small target to shoot at. So the pilots could come in and find this target difficult to see and shoot at it to see if they could imitate hits on an aircraft. This is very interesting because when the Sule came back over the airfield, the aircraft would jettison the cable that he was towing. And as soon as this happened, the Sule would deploy its own parachute and float down to earth without damaging itself, so it could be used again. Well, these pilots, I don't know who it was, but the two escorted pilots were a little bit too good. And one of those pilots got a direct hit and messed up the Sule altogether, and that was the end of it. They weren't supposed to get a direct hit, but that's what happened. We also had another exercise down at Cape Town. It was called, the name of it was called Cape X. That involved the Royal Navy, the South African Navy, the Buccaneers, which we later on nicknamed the Duccaneers, and our squadron. Also the Shackletons. Oh, don't forget about the Shackletons. So it was an interesting exercise. The unfortunate thing is we lost 2 Buccaneers on that exercise. That's why we nicknamed them the Duccaneers. And we had, I think, once again, 15 aircraft to operate there. The Royal Air Force also had their Nimrod there as well. So a good collection of aircraft. And it was very interesting to see when the Nimrod, spit that out again, came back from its sortie. They kept the engines running, and the ground crew would come and spray fresh water down the intakes. This was to wash the salt water, the salt off the turbines. That would indicate how low those blokes used to fly. Yeah, very interesting. What else can I say about the squadron? I think there was a question in one of your podcasts. Somebody asked, how involved was the SAF with the Israelis? Well, I think there was a good involvement. On one occasion, a group of Israeli pilots visited the squadron, and they flew with our blokes, pilots, the SAF pilots. When I say our blokes, not the Rhodesians, and showed them some tricks and what they had developed with their own Mirage 3s in the 6-day war, passing on the information, in other words. But when they saw our officers in the Rhodesian Air Force uniforms, they said, no, what's going on here? So one of the South African pilots says, oh, they're here to learn all about the CZs because they're going to take them back home. And the Israeli pilot said, geez, you blokes are stupid. And the reaction was, why? He says, those are your best bloody aircraft for air battles, for dogfighting. So I don't know if that was an influential matter down the line why we didn't get them, but I think there were some other reasons as well. Another occasion, the sidewinders that we had in the squadron, the heat-seeking missiles that were fitted near the wingtip on the Mirage, they only had a 30-degree envelope. In other words, when it hunted for the heat, seeking the heat, it could only go for 15 degrees either side, a 30-degree envelope. And the Israelis had been working on this, and they had developed, I don't know if you can call it an eye, but the seeking part of it, to now hunt at a 60-degree envelope, 30 degrees each side, and up and down. And these rockets were sidewinders were now being put on trial on the squadron. And there was an Israeli technician. I don't say he was Air Force, he could have been like your CSIR, but he was involved in that on the line, and in fact, with the early trials, showing our blokes how to do it. When the aircraft has started up and the pilot's done his normal cockpit checks, he now gives a signal that he's ready to check the armament. And now he gives the ground crew that signal. The armorer, in this case, in the beginning, the old Israeli bloke, would have a lit cigarette, and from about, I think it was 10 and 15 meters in front of the aircraft, he'd have the lit cigarette and move it side to side like this to test the eye of it picking up the lit cigarette. And it was so sensitive that it did. And part of that check was to see the fins of the missile working from side to side to show that the missile was in sync with the pilot and the missile itself and the heat-seeking part of it. Because the pilot's helmet was also part of that, what do you call it, formula. Because when the pilot looked from side to side, that would help the missile give it a signal, that's where the pilot is looking, I must look there as well. So it is very technical, but just to show that the help we were getting from the Israelis. And I think there was a lot more help involved there. Yeah, I was very honored to be able to have a flight in an aircraft. Every now and again, when if a BZ hadn't flown for a while, the pilots were made aware of it, and they would fly the EZ to get it, going again. You'd never let an aircraft sit too long without flying. And so they'd use this two-seater aircraft in place of a CZ to do whatever exercise they did. So every now and again, it was an opportunity for one of the techs to be offered a seat. And I was very fortunate to be offered a seat in a sortie one day. It was a South African pilot I was with. We went up and our sortie was, I think, a couple of different roles, but near the end, it was to do a dogfight. And the pilot told me that we were now going to enter a dogfight and look out for the enemy. Well, I never saw the enemy. We weren't trained for that. I hadn't a clue where to look, and even I couldn't sight the enemy. But what I did know is every time he pulled G to make an interception or to get out of an incident where somebody got in his tail, I just blacked out. Because I didn't have a G suit on. And the pilots, they had G suits on, which helped them, and also they were conditioned to it. We weren't. But a very interesting flight. What really impressed me was on takeoff, you put into full throttle, let the brakes go, and it was a fair acceleration. But when he put it into full afterburner, once we were rolling, wow, that G-force just kicked you back into the seat. Very impressive. The other very impressive part was, I'd done 400-hour flying hours in the Trojan, flying at very slow speed. And now I'm in this aircraft, and how fast we came in to land. Wow, that was scary. When our time was up, I'd now done 3.5 years on 2 Squadron because I'd volunteered for an extension. The reason is I had a car and a hire purchase, and I wanted to try and pay it off before taking it back, because I'd bought a Mercedes 220 diesel, and I could make some money on that back in Rhodesia. That was the objective. It was second-hand, yes. So we were told when we go back to Rhodesia after our tour, we would go back to our parent stations or sections. If it is an electrician, back to electrical section. In my case, I should go back to 4 Squadron in Thornhill. I knew if I went back to Thornhill, I was still single. If I went back to Thornhill, I would end up having cirrhosis of the liver. So I thought about it. A very good friend of mine who later became my brother-in-law, we spoke about it, and we put on an application asking for a transfer direct to 7 Squadron. Now, I just want to tell you a quick part about 7 Squadron. At that stage, 7 Squadron had fairly junior people operating on it, corporals, etc. But they had 1 or 2 incidences, one quite serious incident, where some aircraft covers flew up into the rotor of an aircraft when he was on the ground. And that caused a hiccup. And they introduced a policy that they would no longer have technicians, in other words, flight engineers, on the squadron that were below the rank of sergeant. So to find more blokes at the rank of sergeant and above to come into the squadron was difficult. Blokes didn't volunteer because you found at that stage, at that rank, most of the blokes were now about to get married or were married, and they weren't interested in bush trips any longer. They wanted to stay at base. So this made it easier for Bert and I to, ask for this transfer, and because it helped them out, we went.
I'm sort of astounded that you were 3.5 years at least in the SAF. You've spoke with all or worked with all these SAF people. You've named names. Please, people, if you hear your own name here, come and talk with us. It'll be great to tie up. Please, people, share this with the 2 Squadron folk. The other folk that operated the 42 Squadron, the Cessna guys, share this. Boss Box, when you mentioned the Boss share Box, and share alike. Thanks for all these mentions of guys. I really, really appreciate it. I also I really enjoyed the fact that you can still remember your parlemun recipe. That's great. Well, your 2 recipes you remembered, parlemun and touch powder. Anyway, I do believe you may still have 1 or 2 little memories from your Mirage days. So feel free to share before we say our goodbyes for episode number 1.
Okay, just something I forgot to mention. Another very prominent chap in the SAF that really got on well with us Rhodesians. In fact, one of our Rhodesians married one of his daughters. His name was Shane Beaton. He was in the engine shop. That's another name I wanted to mention. What I forgot about was when I spoke about that there were about approximately 1/3 South African, 1/3 ACFs on the squadron, and 1/3 Rhodesians. Much later on, all of a sudden, the South Africans on the squadron, majority of them, not all of them, but majority of them, disappeared off to TAFE. I think that's what you called it. Your school in Civvy Street. Your Polytech. They all went there for day school to learn French. They had French lessons. And this is an indication now that they were preparing to go to France to familiarize themselves with the F1s. And that's what happened. Off they went to the school, and it was very interesting because when they came back to the squadron, they were trying to talk to each other in French, and this is very amusing to us. But, trying to practice it before they disappeared off to France. Well, that happened. They disappeared off to France. There was a smattering of South African SAF blokes left on the squadron. But at one stage, that squadron was largely being run by Rhodesian, especially on the first line servicing, by the Rhodesians and the active citizen force. And that's how it went. The when these blokes came back, some of them started preparing what was going to be now 3 squadron, I believe, or one. No, sorry, I think it was 1 squadron. I'm not sure the squadron number, but it was on Waterkloof Air Base, round the corner from the Buccaneers. And as these Mirages being assembled at Atlas, because I think they were flown in C-130s, the Sapphire C-130s, and assembled at Atlas and appearing on the squadron. So these blokes all migrated across that had been on the French courses. And that's where we lost Tubby de Vet. He was one of the more senior of the fitters, which I said we got on very well with. In fact, with Tubby, he actually asked me, he said, Doug, if Margie, that's his wife, has any problems with her car, would you mind helping her out? And I said, no problems. And it actually happened. She had a starter motor failure on a Fiat 128. And I went and sorted out the starter for her. That was the sort of camaraderie ship we had. Just another quick one I forgot to mention. We had 2 aircraft that had to go down to Langebandweg to do an exercise. That exercise was in conjunction with your early warning radar setup in South Africa. So these 2 aircraft had to fly on a daily basis to come screaming in from the sea, whether they were low level, high level, whichever way, to try and get past these defense radars. And that was what the exercise was about. We were there for about 2 weeks. But I think this was a test to see if the Rhodesians could handle themselves, because a whole crew was Rhodesian, 2 pilots and the ground crew that went. We were all Rhodesians. The only South African we had with us was a flight sergeant, old Nick Brits. And the reason he came with us, because they had to have a vluchtversand to deal with the administration side, it's the messing and all that lot. So, and it went off very well. And that pilot that I spoke about that you've already interviewed, Steve Murray, we asked him to give us a monumental beat up. And what he did, but just the build up to the beat up, when a hunter came towards you at high speed, you could hear that engine whining, you could hear the scream of the engine. Likewise with a Sabre. If you heard a Sabre coming towards you, flat out, you could hear his engine. But when that Mirage came towards us, he was now flying very close to the speed of sound. You couldn't hear the engine. Not until he came abeam of us. Just a comparison there. And Steve was so close to breaking the speed of sound, he was actually a worried man. Because when he taxied in and climbed out the aircraft, he says, did I do it? And we said, did you do what? He says, did I break the sound barrier? No, he said, no, you're quite safe. So those were just some other incidences I want to mention. Thank you very much.
Well, Doug, I think you have many people that are envious of you. I am. I never got to ride in a Mirage. I got quite a few Impala hours me before I went to do engineer's course. But yeah, terrific history that you've shared, memories that you've shared. As I said earlier on, folk, if you've heard your name or some of Doug's memories pull on your memory chains, yeah, come and share. Come on, it'll be great to do a bit of a chit chat with a few of you from those days together. That could be arranged and could be a lot of fun. Okay, so for now, I'm going to say, Doug, for episode number 1, yes, I do thank you. I thank you for taking the time of specifically slanting your chat SAF ways so that we SAF guys now know what a K car is. We know what a G car is. We know of all your experiences at Waterkloof and all around the country with Mirages. And yeah, folk, we say thank you to Doug, and we look forward to the second episode where Doug's going to tell us about all his experiences. And I know there's some good experiences because you can go and look for yourself. Fighting Men of Rhodesia. Doug has 4 episodes there. Feel free to go and view those too. But for now, as we always say here at Legacy Conversations, if you've got a story to tell, the email address is going below here now, and it will also be in the description below. For now, as we say at Legacy, as I've said already, until we chat again, God bless.
Dankie, meneer.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated.